Hello, welcome to another episode of Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and with me in the studio today is our webmaster, Doreen McCullough, and we are going to be presenting to you a follow-up program from the one that aired last month called Adventures in DNA. And we've decided, since this topic raises so many questions, that this would be the opportunity to answer questions from various members of our viewing audience. So I will turn this over to you now, Doreen.
Hello, Michael. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Michael, let me start off by asking you this particular question. Why do you think so many people have taken DNA tests?
For a lot of people, it's sheer curiosity. I would say that if we were to survey the vast number of people who have taken DNA tests, the strongest pull is among people that didn't know anything about their past. People who have been cut off from paper records, people through adoption did not know their parents. So certainly among many people that I have encountered that have taken DNA tests, they want to know more about parents, grandparents that they never knew. But there's also, I think, a factor of novelty, and we can certainly talk about the number of people that have taken DNA tests in kind of an amateurish kind of way. People have given it to their children as Christmas presents, vice versa. So some people take the test. They're curious as to what the immediate results might show. But there's a big difference, I think, between just taking a DNA test and being someone who is a serious, committed genealogist.
Okay, my next question, Michael, actually focuses on the ethics of DNA testing. What are the key ethical questions that a person considering DNA testing should really ask themselves before getting DNA testing?
The first thing is a question of privacy. And many of the DNA companies tell you they will not sell your data, but with DNA testing, it opens a box. It may link you into things you may not want to have known, and even by your submitting. So take, for example, I have had my DNA tested, obviously. My mother has had her DNA testing. I have no children. So I saw that as no potential harm of revealing information to descendants that I don't have. But by virtue of the fact that DNA links me to my parents, grandparents, and their extended family, it opens the door to some long-buried secrets. So, for example, by my linking my grandmother's cousins on both sides of the family, it unearthed in two instances someone who was adopted who did not know their biological parents. So one woman who showed up by the numbers, and we'll say more about that in a little bit, that she had to have been a close relative of my mother, but the paper record showed that she was descended from families in Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 40s. I said to this person, there's no way that anyone in my family was connected to Europe at that time. You need to ask yourself the question, is someone adopted in your family? So the answer 6 months later is yes. This woman's biological grandmother was my grandmother's cousin. She had the name. And the question that I asked myself, by giving this stranger more family information, would I be upsetting living people? And since my grandmother's cousin is long deceased and all her known children were deceased, I didn't think there was any harm in giving that information. But I think when people have approached me, people who are adopted and they are looking for information on their biological parents, I have to think long and hard about opening doors that when people made decisions about adoption long ago that might have been for the child's best interest, do we really have a right to open that box and put people's lives on display? So it is a question that I think it's very, very important to consider.
Michael, in your latest program, Adventures in DNA, you had mentioned that your ancestry stems from Ireland. Would you be able to find out when or of a time period that your ancestors lived in Ireland?
Well, that I knew, Doreen, pretty much from the paper trail, because the DNA is not going to tell you when someone came from Ireland. And with my father and my mother having distinct ethnic backgrounds, my father is the grandchild of immigrants, I would have been flabbergasted if something on that side of the family would have shown up other than Irish. But what I find interesting with DNA patterns is that although Dad's grandparents came from Ireland, each of those grandparents had at least one sibling that remained in Ireland. Who are their descendants today? Who were Dad's grandparents' aunts and uncles, and where did they go? So as an example, if people who are related to me on my father's side through DNA currently live in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, how did they get there? So it isn't so much that the DNA will show exactly when someone immigrated, but I think that that evidence together with the paper trail answers a lot of questions.
Okay, that's an important thing to know. To many of our viewers, or as many of our viewers are well aware, there are many types of genealogical testing companies out there, like Ancestry and 23andMe, just to name a few. Where do I even begin to choose the right one?
You have to begin by asking yourself what you hope to gain through DNA testing. The largest database of testers is through Ancestry.com, upwards of 18 to 20 million. The oldest testing company, commercial company on the market, was 23andMe. 23andMe's specialty was your medical history. So a lot of people have used that to determine, are you showing a disposition to likely inherit this disease, etc. There are other companies that do specialized testing that costs more. For example, Family Tree DNA tests your X chromosome, your X genealogy, your matrilineal line. They also do, for males, your Y line through father only. And then, of course, the bulk of what people determine their degree of genetic relationship is through autosomal DNA, that package of DNA that we inherit from both parents. So it really depends on what you want to determine. A cousin of mine who lives in Washington, D.C., is the one of only 2 living women that are descendants of Dad's maternal grandmother. That maternal grandmother, born in Ireland, I know her name, I know her mother's name, but I'm cut off from that history because the records just aren't there. So my cousin in Washington was willing to take the mitochondrial DNA test because it will show us other people that share that mitochondrial line with her. So in a couple of months, that may or may not open doors to me, because the likelihood of a match, of course, depends on who has taken the test. And it isn't that you have a rare genetic line if you don't have matches in a DNA database. It really depends on who has inputted into the database.
Okay. Obviously, ethnicity plays a crucial role in DNA testing. Michael, how accurate are the results you receive from these tests?
Well, that is a slippery slope, isn't it, as I said in the last episode. And just looking between two different companies, one company claims that I'm 88% Irish and 12% Scandinavian, and there's no one in recent recorded history that I'm aware of that came from Scandinavia. I also gave as an example on our last program my mother, who has a known great-grandfather from the Azores, and presumably Mom would carry 12% of his DNA. That shows up on one test and not on another. And this is something that will continue to be refined. I have been waiting impatiently through the month of August because the largest of these companies, Ancestry, has been claiming that it's going to completely revolutionize its reporting of DNA this month. And it's not only going to change ethnicity estimates, it's also going to change how it's going to provide more accurate results of who likely relatives are. And the way they do it is this. The genetic measurement among all companies of the degree of genetic relationship is through centimorgans, lowercase c, capital M. The higher the degree of centimorgans, the more closely that one is related. So right now, in one of the testing companies, it alleges that I have over 1,400 matches. When Ancestry changes its threshold, which could happen by the time I get home today, because we're running late in August, they are going to eliminate any relationship that is less than 8 centimorgans, because when you get to a single-digit number like that, the common ancestor can be so far back in time that it's not traceable. And in areas of the world where there are many endogamous marriages, where cousins have been marrying cousins, and the groom would marry the bride from the next village and so on, to say that you have all of these relatives is not necessarily an accurate thing because the gene pool is relatively small. So all that will change. I think ethnicity is something that goes hand in hand with our awareness of geography and history. So in island nations like Ireland and England, for example, that can be geographically well defined because you have a sea or an ocean around you. When you get into Central Europe and you get into lands that were governed by the great empires of the early 20th century, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the ethnicity question gets very, very complicated. Even as an example, if we look at people who settled in our area and they would say that they were Czechoslovakian, even that is a contradiction in terms because the Czechs and the Slovaks are two very different people historically with different religions over the last 500 years. So to put the two together represents a political configuration of a country after World War I, but it doesn't speak to ethnicity. So it's a complicated factor. And I think the more that people contribute to these databases, the more that we can pinpoint ethnicity with precision. And I do need to add that probably the most well-defined DNA in the world, the oldest DNA in the world, comes from Africa. And very often, when you think of the searing path across history that African Americans have had because the legacy of slavery cuts them off from knowing the names of their forebears, because, of course, adopting the master's name and all of that, the DNA is helping many African Americans today pinpoint with precision where their origins are in the continent of Africa.
Okay, following up on that particular question, if ethnicity is the weakest part of the test, what meaning really does DNA ethnicity have?
I think that when it raises anomalies, it will lead you to further questions. So, for example, if you think your grandmother is primarily Polish or Eastern European, and your DNA estimate comes back is Italian, half Italian, what is going on there? Is it likely to be true? Is it a skewed result? So I think the exploration as revealed in DNA of ethnicity has to be measured against standard research techniques. And again, realize the farther that we go back in time, when there is no paper evidence for our ancestors who lived, it gets more complicated to figure out exactly what ethnicity means.
Yeah, one of the questions that those individuals considering DNA testing should ask themselves is, what happens if my results come back and I find out surprising information that I really didn't want to know?
If you didn't want to know or be open to what investigation might reveal, you shouldn't have done the test in the first place. And I have found in over 40 years of being a genealogist that sometimes research itself disappoints people. And there are several well-known themes that have been recurrent through all these years of research. One is there's a Native American in the family. This is likely true in French Canadian families. And most of the time, it's a legend that is not borne out by history. Or among Irish families, a horse thief or a murderer or a pirate or something like that. And people are sometimes just crushed by the story that grandpa or granny told them that just isn't true. So there's very much that whenever any of us engage in the research process, we have to be open to what we might find. When we do discover things that are genuinely disruptive to living people, I think that we have to proceed very, very carefully. As another example, a man recently contacted me, close degree of relationship, showed me a copy of his paper tree, and the only conclusion that I could come to is that his grandfather was raised by the grandparents because his mother had the child out of wedlock, and this child was raised by the grandparents and passed off as their own child. And even though I suggested to this person this is the only explanation that can satisfy all the criteria in this relationship, this person is not open to assimilating that knowledge. So I'm just not pressing it any further.
Okay. When I discover who my DNA matches are, even the unexpected ones, what measures should I take to, how should I actually initiate a conversation with them?
All the people who have contributed their DNA to the various testing sites have contact information through that testing company. So there is a way to contact them, but here are some of the problems that ensue with that. If you look at when did someone have this test, are they still a member? Because one of the problems with Ancestry is this. Your results are made known to you for a short period of time, but to continue to access the database, you have to pay an annual fee. Whereas with other testing companies like 23andMe, the data that you submit is yours to work with all of the time. So people that are doing this for on a lark or very, very superficial reasons, or who know nothing beyond, let's say, their parents and grandparents, you can't expect them to be able to articulate how this person could be your second, your third cousin, etc. So the way that I usually initiate these conversations: hello, Doreen. This testing company shows that we are probably related. If you would like to pursue this further, please contact me. I have information to share. Compared to the days when I wrote letters for genealogical purposes, and you may remember the number 9 envelopes that fit just within the number 10 envelopes, I would always enclose a stamped self-addressed envelope. Back in the 80s and 90s, when I was still doing paper correspondence, I probably had a 90% answer rate. People that I've contacted that match with me genetically, maybe 1 in 4 write back. And even among the 1 in 4 that write back, in many instances, I know more than the person who submitted the data. So again, these are the people that I laughingly call the spit and run types, because they've taken the test, someone else paid for the test, but they're not heavily invested in it.
Okay. Michael, can you explain to our viewers the concept and process of triangulation?
Yes. You hear that a lot on the various television shows. So we have Henry Louis Gates on PBS, Finding Your Roots. We have Who Do You Think You Are? And then more recently, we've had on primetime television one of the most prominent genetic genealogists, C.C. Moore, and they talk about triangulation. It's essentially this, that you're here and the person that you're related to is here. And all you know initially is that there are X number of centimorgans that show that you have a tie to a common ancestor. So the process of triangulation is that you have the base of the triangle, and what you have to do is work it out to the apex of the triangle to try to determine from whom you're descended. And in families that have, let's take French-Canadian families in Vermont, that probably descend from families of close intermarriages in Quebec, it can get very, very complicated because sometimes both sides of the family overlap. So the process of triangulation has many false positives as to who you think you can be related to, but you have to go back one generation at a time.
For those who have already undergone DNA testing, what are some of the most critical steps that people should take in order to maintain, in order to maximize unlocking their DNA matches?
I think that it's one of these things that you have to be committed to the long term. And among various things that I have been working on, you might not find the answer instantly, but all of that can change. So someone who takes a test whose results are uploaded next week may link me to people that I did not know existed that were out there today. And I have lots of my own examples of how genetic genealogy has allowed me to follow and to link people that would have been unknown or lost to me. In another instance, in a piece of research that I just finished that I have been working on for 7 years, and this is in my aunt's family, she had a relative in Maine named Aretas Wilkins. Aretas Wilkins was impossible to find because he had no birth, no relatives around. How do I find him? well, how many people have you known named Aretas? So I kind of figured out, well, where does this name show up in one particular family? So I had a very good hypothesis that even though there were no paper records to show it, I posited that my aunt's ancestor Aretas belonged to this family. Aretas was orphaned as a child, sent to Maine. That was my hypothesis. Once I made that hypothesis, my aunt contributed her DNA, and eventually, 6-7 months after my initial research, the DNA matches to other families supported my hypothesis. So I think that's one example of how the DNA evidence, hand in hand with traditional research, can prove a family relationship.
Do I still need paper historical records to document my ancestors if I have DNA data?
Yes. I think there's nothing like paper records archivally preserved to preserve history. And I think that all we need to think about is the evanescence of websites, the evanescence of various testing programs. What happens when a satellite blows or a server blows, and what happens to that information. So ultimately, I think it comes down to the fact that, for example, here with my own genetic cousins, at least on paper, from time to time, who they are, I keep a paper copy. There's nothing like paper copies for preservation of history.
Is there a purpose to testing other members within the same family?
Yes, and it depends on how serious you are. One of the things among a family that I know well, the siblings wanted to know, were they more their father's side or their mother's side? Now, theoretically, all siblings are 50% from each parent, but that's not exactly true because it might be 49-51. So when you look at patterns within families, it might be that in this one family that I'm considering, 2 of the siblings were more their father's genetic makeup than their mother's. So when you take it down to the next generation, to the nieces and nephews, that follows down. So that's one of the reasons why that people like to figure this out when there's more than one person tested within the family.
To wrap up our questions for today, Michael, for those who wish to learn more, what books, guides, or videos do you recommend for the novice and intermediate researcher?
I would say the best bet is to go to the library, to go to a local bookstore, to go online, and simply to make sure that when it comes to genetic genealogy, that one is not purchasing something that's more than a couple of years old because things are changing all of the time with that.
That's been very informative. Thank you very much, Michael.
My pleasure, Doreen.